Okay, I'm Lundy Bancroft. So I started about 20 years ago now working as a counselor in a program for abusive men. And that's how I really got my education on domestic violence and a whole set of issues about male violence against women in general. And then it was through my experience working with men who batter that I started to learn about what batters were like as parents and a whole set of things about how they're affecting children in the home. And then that in turn led me to start to realize how often batterers were attempting to get custody of their children away from the abused woman, and how often batterers were actually succeeding in winning custody away from the abused woman. One of the reasons has to do with the level of gender bias that exists in the court system, and this has been documented now in many states, that unlike the early part of the 1900s, when there was actually probably a pro-mother favoring in the courts, there's now a very heavy pro-fathering climate in the courts since about the mid-1970s. When people talk about the maternal preference, that went out long, long ago. Another challenge that we have has to do with how the courts are responding to domestic violence specifically. And I think part of the problem there is that abusers of power come in a lot of different forms in our society, and abusers of power tend to recognize and support each other. And there are many people in court systems who are abusers of power themselves, and I certainly don't want to suggest that they all are. There are very kind, humane, responsible judges. There are kind, responsible, humane lawyers. But unfortunately, mixed in there are a lot of individuals who are really enamored with their own power, throw it around wildly, and enjoy that in some sense. And civil procedure with respect to custody and visitation is very different from other kinds of court processes around a lawsuit or around a criminal prosecution where there's all kinds of rules you have to follow. In a family law proceeding, judges can just do whatever they want. They can say, well, I'm not going to listen to that witness. You're not going to get to talk today to the mother. They can say, today's session is not going to be recorded, or you can't transcribe today's session. They can decide whatever they want. So it's really kangaroo court. And what that atmosphere does is invite those judges who are enamored with power to wield it in a quite unlimited way. And I observe that people who are addicted to power or drawn to power in that way feel a kind of natural affinity for other people who are into power. And so when a judge who's of that style, as some judges are, has before him or her a batterer and a battered woman, that judge, his or her heart, that sort of gut connection that they have, is going to actually naturally go to the batterer, not to the battered woman. That's the person who's going to feel familiar, comfortable, like them, seem enjoyable, seem likable. And the battered woman is going to seem like the irritant, the annoying one, the one who should just live with things, should just shut up and get out of the way, because that's how that judge moves through the world, also feeling that these people should just shut up and get out of his or her way. There are huge economic problems where the batterer just tends to have access to far more economic resource. And people misunderstand sometimes. They think, well, whether you have a lot of money or not determines whether you can hire a good lawyer or not. It's so much more than whether you can hire a good lawyer. It's whether you can afford depositions, whether you can afford trials, whether you can afford a private investigator, whether you can afford expert witnesses. All these different elements have a huge impact in whether you win your case or not. So the money makes a huge difference in who wins, not just because they can hire a better lawyer, but because of all these different expenses that they can afford in their legal case. When a judge makes a bad decision, people often say, well, you should appeal it. Well, an appeal costs you between about $20,000 and $50,000 to run. Most women who are in custody aren't in a position to appeal. So there are huge changes needed in the whole way that our family law system works, including that there have to start being very strict rules of procedure, very strict rules of evidence. We need to start having our court cases videotaped, and there just has to be an overall sense of judicial accountability so that judges, rather than actually being the ones who can get away with the most immature, the most biased, the most unreasonable behavior, are actually the ones being held to the highest standards of responsible, decent, unbiased kind behavior towards litigants. Those are the kinds of changes that we have to reach for. I lead various kinds of weekend retreats for, some of them just for women, but many of them for women and men both, to help promote personal healing and empowerment. And it's to some extent directly related to abuse and to some extent not. So for example, I lead weekends with a woman who's a social worker for women who've escaped an abusive relationship, aren't in it anymore, but are really wanting help with the process of healing. How do I get over what was done to me? How do I leave it behind me? How do I start living with how do I stop living with all the effects of how I was harmed and intimidated in that relationship and move on with my life? We work with people on understanding some of the kinds of traumatic effects they can be left with after a relationship that they were abused in. We help them understand some of the ways that you now need to build support into your life, some of the ways that you need to learn to talk about what happened to you, but not just talk about it. Some of the ways you need to learn to express and work through journal writing, through certain emotional processes, through certain kinds of visioning processes, to work through what happened to you. We work on the issue of how you change your self-image so that you really come to see yourself as you really are, rather than seeing yourself the way the abuser convinced you that you were. And then how you learn to love and trust people again, because one of the tragedies of abuse is that because relationship abuse involves being abused by someone that you once really loved and trusted, it really shakes up then your ability to trust other people. You start to wonder, do I have the ability to know who's trustworthy and who isn't? So one of the things that we work on in our Healing from the Inside Out workshop is to understand that you can make good decisions, and we equip you with some concrete skills for how you read who's trustworthy and who isn't, so that you can have really close friendships again, and so that you can have another good intimate relationship again, and know how to not get involved with another person who's abusive, to know what kind of warning signs to watch out for example. And then I do a weekend that's for activists and advocates in domestic violence and sexual assault trauma, or in social change in general, about how that we can better take care of ourselves and better enjoy our own lives while also working against really painful, horrible things that happen in the world. Because often the people who are trying to bring about the change, they start to sink under the weight of the issue themselves. And so I give a weekend called Caring for Ourselves and Each Other that teaches a lot of different skills for increasing the support that we get, for understanding how what we call secondary trauma works when you're really being traumatized by the trauma that the people you're trying to help are going through, and how to make sure that while you're helping other people heal, you're also living a life that is a healing sort of life for yourself. And then finally, I do a workshop called Cooperative Therapy. That's a healing model that I've developed that's for everyone, men, women, young, old. It doesn't matter what kind of work you do, not in any way directly connected to abuse, that teaches people how to build healing into their life without being reliant on professional therapists. And the primary focus of the cooperative therapy workshops is teaching people how to be cooperative therapists for each other, so that people can actually do a shared session where one of you is counselor for the first half, you take a little break, and the other one of you is counselor for the second half. That way it's free. You're paying for the counseling you're receiving with the counseling that you're giving. But it isn't just about listening. We actually teach a very complex, sophisticated set of therapeutic techniques that I've drawn from various places to form this cooperative therapy system. It doesn't work for everybody, but for a lot of people it not only works well, but works much more effectively than one way professional therapy for pay does, because of the power of the approach, and precisely because it is cooperative. For many people that creates a much more healing type of environment. And we really integrate the support and love into people's lives. We help them figure out how you do that, so that this is really not just going to a therapist once a week for an hour, but a system that's really woven into your whole life. And for many people, a very, very powerful approach to their own healing. The first book that I wrote was a textbook called The Batterer's Parent, and which, by the way, it came out in 2002, and in 2004 it won the annual literary award from the North American Resource Center for Child Welfare. And that was the first book to really look at what problems typically turn up in the parenting of men who abuse women, because there was this widespread misconception before that, well, how a man treats his wife, that doesn't say anything about what kind of father he's going to be. And actually it speaks volumes, usually, about what kind of father he's going to be. And that book also addressed an issue that we really need to zero in on that had not been addressed by previous books, about how often the greatest damage that the batterer is doing is the way that he's damaging the mother's relationships with her children. And that we need to focus much more on the issue of mother-child relationships and how abusers drive wedges between moms and children, pull them apart, get them to mistrust each other, get them angry at each other, get them alienated from each other. And with all this hoopla about alienation that abusers have created, the ones who are really out to destroy children's relationship with the other parent are the abusers. I've heard of a number of examples where judges, after reading the batterer's parent, then reported that they were really changing the way they responded to domestic violence cases that came before them, particularly with respect to custody and visitation and child support. So, and I wrote it with judges and lawyers and custody evaluators as my #1 audience, although I also wrote it for child protective people and for moms themselves. Although When Dad Hurts Mom is actually a lot of the same ideas in a form that's much easier for people to read who aren't in the legal system. I really wanted to get the message across that women who are attempting to protect their children from an abusive father are providing a very important public service. This is a favor to the whole world when you try to keep children safe from exposure to an abuser. And unfortunately, when women try to protect their children from an abusive father, they don't get credit, they don't get appreciated, they get the opposite. They get demonized, they get told that they're vindictive, that they're mentally ill, that they have no reason to be so suspicious of him, that they're just out to destroy his relationship with his children. And that instinct in a parent to protect your children, that's the best of what's in parents, mothers and fathers. And when moms are taking these kinds of brave steps to try to keep their children from having to go unsupervised with an abusive man, that woman should have our wholehearted support. We should be behind her. We shouldn't be criticizing her and accusing her of things and taking her children away from her for attempting to protect them. She should know that we're completely on her side, that we're completely with her. My experience with moms who are attempting to protect their children is that their concerns are overwhelmingly very well founded. Of course, you're going to be able to find a case of someone who has used allegations in a dishonest or manipulative way. Although, by the way, the research shows that when false allegations are brought up as a tactic, that's just as likely to be a father that does that as a mother. Equally likely. And so this whole societal hoopla about how mothers use these abuse allegations for bad purposes, that's a false premise to begin with. But it's not, false allegations aren't used by very many people, period, male or female. Overwhelmingly, when people are saying to a court, I'm really worried about my kids, it's because they have good reason to be worried about their kids. The exception to that is when people are using those allegations to cover for the fact that they are the abuser. And that certainly does happen sometimes. In other words, there are genuine protective fathers out there, and then there are other guys who are trying to present themselves as protective fathers because they're batterers. And they want to cover for what they've done by quickly accusing the mother of having done all these kinds of things. But when I talk to protective moms and I watch them crying and they tell me their stories and they hand me their documents, I find overwhelmingly the concerns are not only bona fide, genuine concerns, but there's good reason for those concerns. And when you hear about these family law cases, you'll hear people say, well, it's just his word against hers. Not very often. Not very often. Usually, you look at the documents, and any reasonable, unbiased person who cares about children would say, these children need to be protected. It's not about his word against hers. That's rarely the case. Usually, it's about judges and custody evaluators and psychological evaluators dismissing concerns that any other reasonable member of the society says, we ought to be worried about that. That sounds like these children are at risk, or it sounds like these children are being harmed.